How do we know what we know? The Art of Today's guest asks us to explore our assumptions about the world through the prism of her installations. A combination of research and imagination, each of these works encourages us to think more deeply about our relationship to animals and their place in our world. On this edition of Art Now, we'll look at the work of Maria Lux.
Hi, welcome to Art Now, a program where we talk to artists whose work is part of our community. I'm Pat Sammann, and I'll be your host. Our guest today is installation artist Maria Lux. She has a BFA in Art and Design and Graphic Design from Iowa State University and an MFA in Studio Art from the University of Illinois. Her work has been exhibited in many Midwestern venues, and she was chosen as one of 10 new U of I artists to watch whose work was featured in the Figure One Gallery in downtown Champaign. She was an artist in residence last year at William Patterson University, and she received an Illinois Arts Council Artist Project Grant in 2013 and an Urbana Public Arts Commission grant in 2014. Maria, thanks for being with us today.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
You've taken a very interesting path in becoming an artist, starting with your childhood wish to be a veterinarian. Why don't you tell us a little about how you got here?
Yeah, well, when I was a kid, I used to draw dogs all the time, and I would get these. Someone gave me a book of like American Kennel Club breed book with all the bones and everything in there, and I was just fascinated by it. But I realized after a while that I was just really interested in drawing them and not necessarily becoming a veterinarian. The day-to-day life of a veterinarian didn't really appeal to me, but the science did. And so my art now engages a lot with other fields, including science, and so it's ended up being a way for me to still be in touch with those early interests that I had, but through the medium of art instead of as a scientist.
Right, but you do have a little training in painting and drawing, right? So you have both that and the interest in the sciences as well. Okay, in your works you're using art as sort of a nonverbal way of exploring and understanding a topic, kind of based on the research that you've done. Can you describe how you usually begin a project?
Yeah, usually my work starts with some story from some other field that usually they're weird stories, something that strikes me as really unusual and that I want to learn more about. Sometimes it's through reading something. People will send me articles, I'll come across some strange object or whatever. And oftentimes I end up drawing from a bunch of different fields for one project. So I'll start in ecology and end up reading about agricultural practices and something from philosophy or something from anthropology. So it's a lot of bringing things together.
Yeah. And there's a long period of kind of letting it stew around in your head before you start?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. A lot of times I'll take notes on something and then, a year later realize, oh, now I finally have the perfect thing to do with that information. So.
Yeah, great. Okay, let's take a look at some of your projects then. This first one is Doghouse/Dollhouse. This project shows many contrasting views of dogs, from regarding them as pieces of property to honoring them as heroes. And I believe it was sparked by a case of animal hoarding, which is kind of what we see here.
Yes, it was. I read an article, I think it was actually like a legal article talking about cases of animal hoarding. And there was one particular story that was just mentioned in there. And the reason it stood out to me was because these people had 400 dogs on their property. And what they had, they were quoted as saying, we're taking good care of them, whatever, we know the name of every dog. That was kind of their way of saying that they cared about them. Right. I thought that was a really striking thing to say. Yeah. When you think about the importance of a name and how we label things changes how much the way that we treat them. So I started looking into that story. I wanted to know the list of the names of the dogs. If there were 400, I wanted the list, and I emailed the sheriff of the county that they were prosecuted in, and the sheriff sent me this email back and said actually they probably knew 10 of their names and the rest of them they didn't know, and that the dogs were listed as evidence numbers, and so he didn't have the names either. So I thought that was really interesting. In one case, it's so important to name them, and the other they were just numbers. So this project had the text from that email that I got from the sheriff in it, and I also included the top 100 names of dogs according to a pet insurance company, so that another way of thinking about them more as property than as individuals. And then it also referenced another artist's work that I came upon a few months before that. I think her name is Charlotte DeMoss, and she was doing profiles of the search and rescue dogs that had worked at Katrina and 9/11 site. And the way that the profiles are written about those dogs, if you switched out the dog's name, they would be indistinguishable from a human. So someone who was a human service worker,
Right.
you know, they end with, you know, she lives with her family and retired to Texas, you know, in
Right,
2011 or
right,
whatever. So,
right.
so it was really striking the differences in how
Right.
dogs in particular are kind of categorized.
Right, absolutely. I do have one other view of it here, so you can see a little bit closer.
Yeah, so this shows 100 dogs in one room. So imagine 4 times as many.
Wow. Yeah, that'd be a lot of dogs. Okay, this next one is Ecology of Invasion. In this project, you highlighted the warlike attitudes of people to controlling invasive species, as well as how animals kind of intertwine with humans during war. I know we don't have all the elements of the project here. I don't know if you want to talk about the ones we do have first, and then...
Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
This
okay.
this is pretty typical of one of my installations, which is that it has a whole bunch of pieces that are kind of meant to link ideas across one another. So this is just one small piece. But this is these are cast plastic mice, cast from real mice bodies actually, and they're
Wow.
made to be like those toy parachute army men that.
Right. And then
cheap
I do
plastic things,
have
yeah.
a view here.
Yeah, you can see one unfolded there. So the start of this piece came from a true story about the management tactics being employed, this was recently, within the past 5 years or so, to manage the invasive brown tree snake population in Guam. So the one thing they've been trying is to parachute in poison-laced mice into the tree canopy where the snakes live in order to help manage their population. I thought that was an amazing thing to do, this idea of these little mice flying down from helicopters into the trees. So that's what started this project. And as it turns out, the brown tree snakes is kind of a textbook case of invasive species. And it appears that they came to Guam via military operations. So we have a huge military base there.
Okay, so it all kind of
Yeah, so it ties together this kind of militaristic approach to dealing with the snakes and the fact that they came in because of war to begin with.
Right, and another element of this was these medals that you had. I think they each, below each you had listed a name of one of the invasive species.
Yeah, so the brown tree snake is only the most recent of many invasive species that have taken a hold in Guam. And so this kind of commemorates many of them that have been successful, all from different countries, different parts of the world. Rats are on there, pigs are on there. And so the medals kind of correspond with their country of origin as well.
Right. And then here we have a little box of rats in war, and talking about several different ways that rats are involved.
Yeah. So this kind of is in the style of a traveling diorama box, which they have these at the Field Museum and other museums. They used to, you can check them out and take them places. And so this idea that even the object itself would be something that would travel someplace else. And that's, it talks about a lot of different ways that rats were purposefully used in war to carry poisons or explosives, and then also the ways that they were sort of a part of it in the trenches and what have you.
Right, yeah. I'm just curious, did you get any, what were the views of people who saw this? I mean, how did they react to it?
That's a great question. I'm not sure. I wasn't there a lot when other people were in this space.
Okay. Let's move on to this one, which is called Big Pork. It began as an exploration of why the biggest boar contest was discontinued at the Illinois State Fair. And I think it evolved into an examination of our conflicting views about large animals like this boar.
Yeah. So I'm from Iowa, and the biggest boar contest is a really big deal where I'm from. And so I was excited to show some friends, the Illinois State Fair surely must have it too, and I can't wait to show you guys this giant pig. And then he wasn't there. And so it was a really great opportunity to talk to a bunch of people and try to figure out what was going on. I ended up talking with a veterinarian and someone from the National Pork Board and the swine barn manager at the Illinois State Fair. And through all of that research, ended up just trying to figure out if it was cruel or not, to raise a pig that size. And in the end, the opinions were still really conflicting, and I was left with the kind of bigger issue of how do we react to large animals like that? We stand around them and make these kind of absurd jokes and get really interested in them just because they're big, which is sort of a really oversimplified way of interacting with something, and it kind of I feel makes us a little oversimplified too.
Yeah.
And it was kind of interesting because the piece itself is the size of the world's largest pig when he was alive. So
I think we've got another view of him here.
Yeah, so it's a very large piece. It's 8 feet long, 4 feet tall.
Yeah.
And so the piece does the same thing that the real animal does, which is people get like, oh my gosh, it's so big, and they point at it and they make stupid jokes. And so it's kind of interesting that it sort of enacts the kind of thing that I'm thinking about being critical of.
Okay, and then another piece of this was some drawings that you have here, and they show differing views to the same animal.
Yeah. So all that research was really, really interesting to me, and it was hard to get it into the final piece. That's something I struggle with all the time. And as you saw with some of the other pieces, there's text, like diorama box had a lot of it.
Yeah.
The giant pig statue didn't have a place for that. So I decided to make a whole series of postcards that would tell the story of the research. So this is one of those. They're all...
and here's another.
Yeah, so they're all watercolor postcards. Some are traced and some are invented and some are referencing real historical postcards. So, which obviously has kind of the vocabulary of, you can't, I wish you were here to see this crazy state fair thing is certainly
exactly,
in the postcards.
Yeah. Here's another where they're actually interviewing the pig.
Yeah, this is recent. This was from, I think, last year's Iowa State Fair, the kind of silliness that goes around this animal.
Right, exactly. Okay, next one we're going to look at is Red Planet, and this is very whimsical. It describes an imagined history in which beleaguered prairie dogs become an extraterrestrial threat. And each of these collages, these are collages, right? Yeah.
They're actually dioramas. It's hard to tell.
Okay.
They're three-dimensional, so they're little strips of wood. Yeah.
And each of those illustrates a step in the history, and I'll let you just talk about each of these.
Yeah, sure. So this project actually picks up where the Ecology of Invasions project left off. So previously I was thinking about invasion biology and the language that goes around that. And then there's like there's a whole genre of literature called invasion literature that was developed around the same time, and oftentimes pitted, alien invaders against us, but was really a way to deal with the anxieties of thinking about the Germans invading or whoever we were afraid of at the time.
Right.
So I was interested in looking at that fiction, and so I felt it was appropriate to make up my own fiction in that in that field. So these dioramas are often based in fact, but are obviously quite imaginative. So it starts out with these prairie dogs in the American frontier. They're digging holes. They're out there in Colorado or something, but they're unwanted. Prairie dogs are not invasive species out there. They're like a keystone species in the environment, but they're still an unwanted species, and they're treated like pests.
Pests, yeah.
So in this first scene, the prairie dogs are being removed by a prairie dog vacuum.
Oh, dear.
And that is one of the real pieces of information that you would not believe was real. This was actually one of the more humane methods of relocating prairie dogs, so they didn't kill them. The other approaches are, smoke bombs and poisons and snipers, and this is one where someone converted an old septic sucking tank into a vacuum to suck the prairie dogs out of the ground, and then they just get moved someplace else. So
wow, okay.
This is where they start, and then since the prairie dogs aren't wanted anywhere, they end up in Siberia, which is the place where anybody who doesn't know where else to go ends up. And in this story, the Russians, since they are very keen on beating America at all of the scientific achievements, have devised a prairie dog translating machine that can translate the very complicated and descriptive language of prairie dogs into English. That's also based on a real thing. There are some studies recently that show that prairie dogs, their chirps actually refer to like certain people in their environment, and they can describe that this one's tall and this one has a blue jacket and things like that. So there's some interesting potential there.
Yeah.
So so in this story, they have learned to communicate with the prairie dogs.
Okay.
And since the Russians like sending animals to space, and since these prairie dogs are very adventurous, they decide we're going to send these prairie dogs to Mars. So,
that's great. Okay.
And then in this scene, the prairie dogs have colonized Mars, and because the environment actually looks quite a bit like the American West, they felt right at home, and they found themselves in subterranean water. And so they've been living on Mars comfortably. And then meanwhile, we go back to the forests of Guam again. So I kind of picked up that location. And this is a military base in Guam where this poor ranger has been sitting and listening to radio signals from space, hoping to hear something from someone. And suddenly he gets a message, and it's the prairie dogs. And they say, hello, and we found one of your Mars rovers. And then in the last scene, NASA has to make a decision. So the Mars rovers have gotten stuck in a prairie dog burrow, and the prairie dogs are waving a little white flag of surrender, and NASA has its little laser beam pointed at the prairie dogs, and it's a moment of decision of whether or not they want to destroy what they think are pests there as well, or whether they have more claim to the land because they've been there before.
Yeah, they were there
before
first.
we were. And the holes being a problem for the Mars rovers is also one of the main complaints that people make for having prairie dogs in the American West, that horses and cattle will get caught in the holes. And
right.
So it's kind of full circle.
Absolutely. And then here we see the prairie dogs listening to the radio, which is broadcasting War of the Worlds.
Yeah. So War of the Worlds is, of course, a classic example of invasion literature, and it's also a really, probably one of the most famous radio broadcasts of all time.
Yeah.
And so I was thinking about this idea of radio, listening for aliens and radio broadcasts, and radio as a mode of transmission across long distances. So I thought that they should be listening to that story.
Yeah, and I just have one more shot here of some of them sitting in the chair. You did a great job with this. Okay, this next project is Monarchy. This piece is modeled after the British crown jewels, and it puts meat in the context of its identification with American masculinity. I've got a couple other views of this too.
Sure. Yeah, this project started in an unusual way for me. I met some folks at a conference a couple years ago, and then I was contacted a bit later by one of the artists that I met at the conference, and she was putting together a book of artists who made work in response to Carol J. Adams' really influential book, The Sexual Politics of Meat.
Okay.
And so she asked if I wanted to contribute something to this book, and there was going to be a show with the book, and I had never read the book. So I said, well, I can't really, I don't have anything to share with you. She says, well, make something if you want. So I said, okay, well, this will be interesting. I haven't really approached a project in that way, where I was reading the text specifically to try to make something out of it. And so that was a lot more directed than I was used to. It was really interesting to read it with that in mind, and this is what I came up with. So her argument has a lot to do with power and masculine power being associated with meat eating. And she uses the example of paintings of Henry VIII and eating a bunch of turkey legs and things like that, and next to paintings of all of his wives holding vegetables. And it's a perfect example of her kind of thesis. And so so that story brings up kind of the British side of things. And then I happened upon an article in Men's Health magazine that was all about how American men need to eat more red meat because red meat is very American. And even in that article, a recent article, and basically said all the same things she was saying in 1990.
Right.
So nothing had changed in the span of this time.
Right.
And it even made some direct points like, the mad cow disease scare was happening at the time that article was written, and so it made the point that, that's happening in the UK anyway. That's not happening in America. American beef is safe, and so really aligning American identity with meat eating. So that's why I used a Burger King crown as the basis of the crown.
Okay, and then here's some of the detail on the crown. Okay, next project we're going to look at is Float. Now, you created this installation for the William Patterson University Galleries when you were their artist in residence last fall. It's based on texts about technology and extinction, and you've created a fictional future rose parade that leads us to consider the relationship of technology to animal and plant life.
Yeah, so this project, there were 3 or 4 different texts that I was reading that I felt kind of related to each other. And I had been wanting to make a parade float for a while and not quite sure what the right context was. And then when I was given this residency, it was a perfect opportunity. They're very generous with time and space, and so I could actually be really ambitious. And so this one's definitely, it's covered in over 5,000 petals just on the base alone. So it was definitely an ambitious thing to do. I thankfully had a lot of help. But anyway, so I made the float first, and it has to do with, well, some of this is in the stop motion video that I think we're going to watch.
And I do have a couple more shots of the float itself too. I think I've got a close-up actually of the petals there.
Yeah. So one of the texts talks about extinction and the the movie Jurassic Park in particular, and how that was kind of using technology to fight against extinction, and some other contemporary efforts to make artificial animals that only live in digital worlds. It references the book Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which is I've referenced in a couple other projects as well. And then also this story that a friend of mine told me about sheep drowning when they fall off the edge of boats in the North Atlantic, which I think is explained a little bit later.
Right.
So the float is covered with artificial flowers, but it looks like the rose parade floats that you would see.
Right.
That are, of course, all 100% natural. So.
Right. Okay. And there's, that's what you did for the stop motion video,
Yes.
and we're actually going to take a look at that right now.
Year's tradition. And now, the greatest spectacle of them all, the Tournament of Roses Parade. Next.
Welcome back to coverage of the 2068 Tournament of Roses Parade.
So great to be here. This is really a special year for the Rose Parade.
It sure is, Marcia. Historically, the parade required that all surfaces of floats be decorated in natural materials derived from flowers and plants. This is the first ever 100% artificial rose parade, and every surface is synthetic.
That is incredible.
It sure is, Marcia. Taking center stage now is a stately entry brought to you by the Van Ness Pet Hospital titled Preserving the Future. This spectacular float tells the story of the dangers of raising sheep in island communities of the North Atlantic. Sheep are often moved from island to island on small boats, and if the sheep goes overboard, their wool instantly takes on up to 1.5 times their weight in water. Sometimes shepherds have to let sheep drown because their added weight can take the whole boat under.
What a story. These charming sheep certainly won't drown because they're sporting life jackets made of artificial California zinnias and undying orange buttercups.
You know, Marcia, speaking of getting wet, let's get a look at that sky. There have been threats of rain all week, and we are watching the weather.
Oh, we don't like the look of that. When floats were still covered with living flowers, rain could be a real problem. Floats had to be engineered to support up to 3 times their weight in added water in the event of rain.
Let's hope it doesn't rain on this parade. You know, they say the tournament has a deal with God. They'll never hold the parade on a Sunday, and he'll never let it rain on the Rose Parade.
Actually, Steve, according to the Tournament of Roses Association, the Never on a Sunday policy was started to prevent horses tied up next to churches from getting scared during the service.
You know, when the parade began in 1890, all floats themselves were horse-drawn. Since the invention of the car, floats have been built on car chassis, just as the horse was replaced by the car.
Wow, how technology changes. This next entry is a real treat. A beautiful vintage 1993 Ford Explorer from the classic film Jurassic Park. You may remember this famous scene where a T-Rex that's been brought back from extinction through modern science just destroys this car. I think we have a clip of that now.
That car actually looks like it's in pretty good shape considering all it's been through, don't you think?
It's looking pretty good.
Up next, we have the Roslyn Auxiliary Marching Sheep, sponsored by the 6 LLS Corporation. These beauties may look real, but they are totally artificial. This flock of sheep was created in homage to the famous science fiction book Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, published over 100 years ago. It imagines a future not at all unlike today, where animals have been replaced by artificial ones.
Okay. It's pretty good. Now, obviously in this project you used a lot of different processes, digital processes, CNC milling, 3D printing, and the video. Just wondered how you determine what media you're going to use in a given work.
Usually the media is determined by the thing I'm making. As you mentioned at the beginning, my background is in really traditional oil painting and drawing. But when I started doing more three-dimensional objects, it opened up a whole world of different materials to use. And a lot of times I find myself not knowing how to do it. And so it's a really it's really fun for me to learn something new whenever I come upon something that needs to be made. With the cast mice, for instance, I've never done casting before. It was definitely a real challenge to figure out how to cast from living or once living materials. With the CNC project, actually had a lot of help from some student assistants at William Patterson University who were really great at helping me create the digital file and run the machinery. So yeah, I really enjoyed the opportunity to learn the new thing, and it's always dictated by the project itself.
Right. Okay, this last one we're going to look at is Veneta Still Life with Bats. This installation weaves together the connection of fruit bats that carry human transmissible diseases with plague stones from the Middle Ages. So I think probably we have to explain what a plague stone is first.
Yeah, sure. So a plague stone is back when a town in the UK, for instance, would be quarantined because of the plague. They still needed to get supplies in and out, and so what they would do is they'd have the stone kind of on the edge of their city limits, and they would have a depression in the top where they'd put vinegar, and then they could leave money there, and the neighboring villages that weren't infected could leave goods and whatever they needed. So it was a place of commerce even when one group was quarantined. And I thought that was a really interesting object. And so this piece is installed in an abandoned mall. And this was a show that a group of, I believe, students in Tennessee were curating. And so I made this piece specifically for this location because of that, because it was a place of commerce and a place of trade.
Right.
And so the plague stone is sitting underneath, and then the bats are sewn out of pieces of clothing as well.
Yeah,
so
and
this
I
used to
think
be a
we've got
clothing store, and you can see there's
a shot of them here.
shirts and things like that have been used to make their wings.
Yeah. And there's actually a shot of the stone itself.
Yeah. So this is a replica of one from a specific town called Iam in the UK, and it was particularly hard hit, and it was interesting because the way that the plague was introduced to the town was through clothing. It was a box of cloth that was sent to a tailor, and then that's how the fleas got into town. So it connects up with the clothing as well.
Yeah. Okay, well, thanks again for being with us. I really learned a lot.
Yeah, thank you so much.
A lot of fun. Thanks. Our guest today has been installation artist Maria Lux. You can learn more about her work at marialux.net. We hope you have enjoyed today's show, and we also hope it will inspire you to explore the local art scene and to make your own art now.